Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to this week's episode of the Legal Beagle podcast. This week, we are joined all the way from Hong Kong by Wesley Thysse. He is the author of what I consider to be the most influential white paper that has come out since the Bitcoin white paper back in 2008. 10 years later, in 2018, Wesley authored a paper called Decentralization. I want to get it right. The Decentralized Legal System. And I spent time reading this paper recently and then actually read it again today. And I learned new things today that I missed the first time. And I just want to jump right in, Wesley. What prompted you to write this white paper?
Yeah, so I started writing this back in 2017. I don't know if you were in the Bitcoin space those days, but it was sort of like the period of those ICOs. And everybody was creating a new product, and they all thought that the blockchain is going to decentralize everything. So there were people creating new countries, creating new kinds of corporations, and all sorts of projects. And every time I started reading those white papers, I got a lot of question marks, like what are they actually doing? Does this actually work? Because these people mostly, they just came up with a technological idea, but they completely ignored the legal part of it. And I read about, maybe 10 or 50 white papers, and none of them really mentioned what they were going to do. And they're raising all these millions of dollars. And so I figured out, if nobody is going to do that, then maybe I should come up with some sort of framework. And it took me a while to figure out, first of all, what everybody was doing. And second of all, just to really study the legal system to see what could we do in terms of coming up with some kind of decentralized legal framework. And that's that research is all summarized in that white paper you just mentioned.
How long did it take you to put this together? If you started working on it in 2017, was this a full year of work, or was it a little less than that?
No, it was. I think it took me about 13 months to finish. Obviously, it wasn't full time. I still have my other work to do, but I did spend a lot of time, especially because I just went really through the legal system. Like, what are the different aspects, and where can we find opportunities? And all of it together. I had to read about international law, arbitration. All sorts of different topics where before that I really wasn't that familiar with. So it all took a lot of time, but it was a very interesting project. I learned a lot from it. So it was time well spent.
Well, you break it down into 4 categories in the white paper. You talk about smart contracts, which I think anyone in this space at least understands the basics of that. Then you go into decentralized jurisdictions. You then talk about decentralized arbitrations, and then finally decentralized companies. And at the end, and I implore you, for those that are going to go read this white paper, don't skip to the end. There are solutions and frameworks that Wesley offers, but you really need to understand the history that our law has evolved through in order to understand where we're going and why this new framework might actually work. But let me back up to the 4 categories. Why did you think it was important to focus on smart contracts and then jurisdictions, arbitrations, and companies? Why were those the 4 main focus points?
Yeah, it was mainly given by the market, because that's what people were focusing on. There was a lot of different projects, and they all were somehow categorized or fit within those categories. So that was the reason why I got to those 4 categories, because those are what people were working on. By now, there's a couple of more, for example, decentralized finance, and I forgot another one. But there's people are working on more kinds of projects now. But those were the 4 projects that I researched those at that time.
You mentioned in the first category, smart contracts, you mentioned something that really resonated with me because I didn't think about it until you said this. You said one of the historical examples of a smart contract is the vending machine.
Yeah.
And you talk about, really, that's a transaction that we've been doing for a long time as human beings, and we don't realize we've actually been engaging in a smart contract with the machine.
Yeah.
That once we put our money into it, it feeds us a product that we would want. It just hit me, and for those that are not very familiar with this area of thought, it's something that I've used since I've read this white paper to explain it to people. I'm like, hey, let me explain what a smart contract is in a very basic form. And it resonates with everyone because I think people can appreciate that. But going deeper into smart contracts, you start talking about the difference and really the wet contract, or excuse me, wet code versus dry code, and how those two things kind of have to interact together if this is going to work going forward. And I think wet code, if I understand it, is really human language, whereas dry code is computer language. Is that safe to say?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
how do those two things merge, and how do you see those working hand in hand?
Yeah. So first, if you look at smart contracts, what they are, as you said, they are vending machines. They're relatively simplistic contracts that perform a certain task. So if you look at computer code, the outcomes are usually binary. So it's either yes or no. And what happens with a sale? You throw a coin in, and something registered that it was paid, and then it pays out the let's say the Coca-Cola. And that's a very simplistic transaction, and it's called it's a binary transaction. Now, if you compare that to a human contract, for example, a labor contract, there are all sorts of different outcomes. There are a lot more different things we have to cover, and one of the main problems is the outcomes of human contracts are not binary. If you, for example, have a court case, there can be you never really know. It's often not a yes or no decision. There can be all sorts of nuances. So it's very different. Human contracts are very difficult to merge into a very simple yes or no decision, and especially with smart contracts, who are basically fixed. So once you put on a smart contract on the blockchain, it will either it will then from then on just make yes or no decisions, and that's sort of it. There's a lot of limits to what it can do. Obviously, I'm making it a bit simplistic now, but that's sort of like the gist of it. So to merge those, there has to be some sort of connection, and that's one of the things I set out in my framework to do. So how do you merge those? And there are ways to merge, or to at least connect a smart contract to a human contract, for example, by uploading a separate human contract, or wet code, as they call it, on the blockchain as well. So I don't know if this answers your question, but
yeah, I think there's a lot. I mean, this is obviously an evolving area of thought right now, right? As we try to understand how to use the blockchain and the cyberspace that we're operating in, and how to kind of create some framework for some legal system that makes sense, that everyone can agree on. But then you go into the second category. You start talking about decentralized jurisdictions, and as a lawyer myself, I was thinking about the idea of what a jurisdiction is. And again, you said something, you were talking about, in order to have a jurisdiction, you have to have a physical location. Well, within the cyberspace, you really can't have a physical location, and that seems problematic.
Yeah.
And I don't want to race to the end where you try to solve that, but why did you identify that as an issue in terms of how this legal framework could interact with the blockchain and the technology in a decentralized landscape?
Yeah, so this is one of the questions that nobody really answers in the blockchain space. At least not those days. It's really just it's one of the fundamental problems, right? I mean, who has the right to rule on a legal dispute within the framework? And if you look historically, there was no cyberspace, so all the jurisdictions, they were either, well, mostly they are part of a country. Like boundaries of a country, or within the state, for example, in the US, or the municipality, and someone has a right to rule on a certain part of land. And there has not been much of a precedent for decentralized jurisdictions, because there was never the technology. So the only real option I have found is that a jurisdiction by agreement. For example, if you and I sign an agreement, we can agree that a certain arbitration court, for example, has the right to rule on that contract. And so that's to me seems like the only real practical solution to this problem.
So you're talking about a consensus jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, that's what it would. Okay, the consensus jurisdiction is in the end. So that's sort of like the bridge I came up with. Like if you and I can come up with a contract that someone has the right to rule on, then yeah, why not involve more people in that contract, right? So in the same way as you would, if you go to Facebook and you agree with their terms, we can also come together and agree to our terms together, and that could create some sort of consensus jurisdiction that would govern all our interaction, as long as we're part of that that particular business model or whatever we are agreeing upon. So that's a consensus jurisdiction.
But you're talking, and you mentioned this in the white paper, you say that we're really talking about private law and the idea of the application of private law. How does that work? How do you have a consensus jurisdiction if you're going to govern things that are beyond two interactions between two parties? Let's say you and I, but now there's something that needs to happen that's maybe has some legal recourse beyond the agreement you and I have. What jurisdiction then governs that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ideas. Obviously, the first one is to have a. If you have a contract, there's often a governing law, right? So this could be, for example, a commonly used law, like for example, English law, for example, which is used a lot, especially in this part of the world, is to govern international agreements. And so what then happens? Then we have our private contract, which is governed by sort of like the consensus jurisdiction, which the industry agreed on, and above that you could have, for example, English law to cover the stuff that isn't covered within those jurisdictions. And if we look at it from that perspective, this is definitely something that needs to be built up from the ground up. So first we start with these smart contracts governing ourselves, and then the consensus jurisdiction, and then English law. But at one point, we could come up perhaps with more broad consensus jurisdictions on multiple topics. I mean, there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. That has already happened in history as well. But it would take some time.
Sure. What problems arise? I found myself thinking when I was reading this particular section of the white paper about jurisdictions. Yeah. Why can't the jurisdiction be all of cyberspace? Is that too vast? Is that too impractical to make it all of cyberspace? I mean, rather than just trying to narrow it down to certain transactions or certain categories of transactions, why can't jurisdiction just be limitless? And what I'm really getting at is copying the idea of international law, which you spent a lot of time talking about. And if you don't mind, for our viewers and our listeners, just explaining how international law exists and why it exists. I don't think I even understood this until I read your white paper, the history of how there's really these agreements between these nations that allow for international law. But I'll let you kind of explain it in a more articulate way.
Yeah, so international law is something that came up 16th century, which basically governs interactions between nations. So in the beginning, that was just nations at war. What are the laws that govern them? And it could be, if you look very back simplistic, waving a white flag. That means that the person waving a white flag is immune for whatever kind of prosecution. And that's how it all started. And it was just how most of the European nations engaged in war. Now, that whole idea of international law that morphed into all sorts of other areas of life. For example, another important is the law of the sea. So the seas belong to no one. So if you go 10 kilometers out of your sort of like your the coast, then you have 200 kilometers of economic zone, and after that the sea is just for everybody. So that's an agreement that has been made by international agreement, and that's just agreements between nations. And that idea, it started off with that, but now we have the World Trade Organization. There is the WHO. There is OECD. So a lot of things are now being agreed on a level above the national level between nations. In a way, they are also coming up with a consensus jurisdiction, right? Because they all agree to act in certain ways. So a practical example, if you look at the Corona situation, a lot of it is based on international health regulations that were issued in 2005, which states that once WHO declares a pandemic, then all the nations subscribing to that contract have to start interacting in a certain way. And that's why when the WHO declared a pandemic, within 3 days, all these countries started to have lockdowns and things like that. That was all agreed in that contract. So it definitely has a lot of impact. And I don't know if that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, because I think what you're getting at is international law is really a framework that exists by agreement and recognition, exactly. Right? They recognize these principles. And I love that you use the example, the law of the sea, because I was just thinking this when you were saying this. So let's say I have a ship and it's a United States ship and it's out in this area of the sea that's just everyone's space. And you have a ship from the Netherlands and they run into each other and cargo is lost. And there's now this claim that one country is responsible to the other country. There is some remedy now on how to deal with that. There is some agreement on how to deal with that right now, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And then would apply the laws. Usually the ships sail under a flag. So the laws of the country that they sail under that apply. So that's the one. And the other one it really prevents is that for someone, let's say a country like Russia, just moving into the Gulf Coast to start drilling for oil or something. You know, that those are all things that are solved by those international agreements. So these international agreements are very important and they are very influential. And as of late, they have become also more and more influential on our daily life. If you look, for example, at cryptocurrencies, there have been now a lot of legislation that's being passed. That's sort of like determine how you can and cannot transact with them. And those have also been passed at the international level and are now being enforced through national governments. So it's definitely very influential.
Yeah, I was reading that there's this agreement, at least internationally, to prevent criminal activity through the use of cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
But I also watched a podcast that you were on about FAFT. You had this Reddit post, and I was trying to understand some of it. I didn't understand all of it. But for our audience, can you explain what was happening with FAFT and what has come of this task force?
Yeah, so there's a financial action task force which has been ordered by the G20. So this is the highest level of government, international government conference. And they came up, they looked at these cryptocurrencies and see that people are transacting money all around the world without anybody really having a control over it. And that scared international regulators. And they came up with they ordered this organization called Financial Action Task Force to come up with regulations. And they passed those regulations, or at least they came up with an early framework last March. And that was quite comprehensive. So I read that, I knew exactly what was going to happen, what's going to happen in this industry. And then last October, they sort of like finalized it. And now countries around the world are starting to implement this. And it's basically, there's a lot of different areas. They really looked at all the areas of cryptos. But the general idea is that they want to restrict most of the activities to regulated exchanges so that people cannot interact freely as it was supposed to be. So it's quite comprehensive. We're going to see it. It's going to be an interesting battle the coming years to see if we can keep crypto the way it is, or it's going to morph into the existing financial system.
But isn't that the whole point of crypto? Wasn't that the whole point of this white paper by Nakamoto, that it was the idea of blockchain and decentralization is no one does control it? Isn't that exactly the beauty behind it? And I think that's why there's this uprising fighting FAFT and these other organizations that are trying to wrap their arms around it. I understand why a government might be concerned. Yeah. But on the opposite side of that, the free market is what's really driving this whole idea of decentralization. It's very much part of the white paper that you wrote.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of tension between those two forces right there. You have on one side, you have these governments that are trying to regulate everything, and on the other side, it's the believers in this this idea and this platform and the technology are saying, no, that's the whole reason we have it, is because it doesn't have to be controlled by one entity. It doesn't need to be controlled by one group of people. It is for the people. It is for everyone worldwide. And I just think that's a fascinating thought, that right now what you're seeing is, and I don't know, I mean, the cat's out of the bag with Bitcoin in my opinion, meaning I don't think you can regulate crypto. You can just regulate the way we interact with crypto as human beings.
Yeah, exactly.
That's, I think, what you're going to see happen. I don't think there's a way to regulate it because it's too far down the road. But the problem with that, at least as I see it, and please, give me your thoughts, is that all you do is create a situation where you're now going back to fiat currency, which is not what people are wanting and not what people really have rallied behind when it comes to crypto. Is that what you see?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. So if we look at those regulations, they just apply regulations that exist on for banks, and then they want to try to apply it to crypto. So if you look at legal systems, obviously they don't fall from the sky. So there's a time for it to develop. So if you look at this is called anti-money laundering and terrorist financing legislation. If you look at that, that was always applied to banks, because the banks are sort of like the enforcers of it. They are the ones who monitor the transactions, and they are the ones who get to enforce this kind of stuff. But in crypto there are there's no need for banks, or there's no need for intermediaries. So obviously those legislation, it cannot work if there's no third parties, and that's what these FATF is trying to do. They are already labeling the exchanges as regulated entities, and then they say that people who have it private, they have unhosted wallets, and the logical consequence of making this distinction is that at one point they might say, okay, you're not allowed to use unhosted wallets, you're only allowed to use wallets and exchanges. And then, that way try to bring it into the regulatory fold. Now, obviously, I think that it's not going to be as easy as they think, and there's definitely going to be a lot of people who will just simply ignore it. I also will keep some of my cryptos outside of the regulated system, just as a matter of principle.
Can you explain the difference between an unhosted wallet and a wallet that's on an exchange?
Yeah, so an unhosted wallet is simply how Bitcoin was intended. You download the wallet on your phone or on your computer, and then you wire the crypto there, and that's under your full control. And that is but it's unhosted in terms of it's unhosted from a regulatory point of view. So when it's unhosted, then you can transact whoever you want with, and that causes, from a regulatory point of view, risks, because you could wire it in theory to a terrorist organization in Libya, for example.
Well, and there's got to be tax consequences, right? And that's part of this regulation is how does these governments, the G20, and then even beyond that, how do they have some sort of tax implication to the trading or the use of cryptocurrency? And I think right now there's still a lot of uncertainty, or at least a lot of people that are asking questions. I recently got involved with a DAO, and that's one of the big discussions that they're having right now is how do we be responsible? How are we going to be aware of tax implications? This is worldwide, right? So you have a lot of different countries that are at play here, and all different regulations and tax issues that could come up. And I think that's a really murky gray area right now. Are you seeing further work in that space? I know you do some of this tax work. How are you advising clients, and how are you saying people should be aware of the tax implications of using cryptocurrency?
It is very, very difficult, as you say, especially when you are interacting at an international level. Let's say a DAO, and you work with a lot of people together on a project. If you look at tax laws, they are first of all, they apply regardless of what kind of technology you use, right? So it's it's not necessarily if you are engaging in Bitcoin that you don't have to pay taxes on your gain. And sometimes I see on Reddit people who just assume that is the case. Usually that kind of income is just, tax laws apply to persons. So whatever you are living, that those laws apply to you. So whatever you do on the internet, then this gets added to whatever you are doing. Your taxable income, for example. Now, how that will work with DAOs, I guess somewhat similar to how it currently works, right? So it either is done through a company, and then the company is responsible for this for the tax payment, and then whatever income is generated by the participants of the DAO, that will add it to their taxable income. But it's definitely going to be difficult when people interact without a legal person. So, for example, the DAO is not an incorporated entity; it's just a bunch of people who are working together on the internet on a certain problem and shifting all sorts of money around. Plus, there is an issue of let's say a treasury. For example, a lot of DAOs have cryptocurrencies in them, and these then exist in cyberspace. That's also a bit of a weird issue. There's definitely an interesting concept, but there's no easy solutions, and it all depends. Every DAO and every project is different also, so that makes it even more complex.
While we're on the topic of cryptocurrency, I wanted to ask you about this Twitter post that I saw. Do you follow Tyler Winklevoss at all? He's the crypto investor.
Yeah, I know it is. Yeah, of course.
Okay, so I just want to read a few of these to you, Wesley, just because I was fascinated. He went on this Twitter rant where he posted 19 tweets about blockchain, and he says this, and I'm just going to condense it a little bit. Yeah. But he basically talks about blockchain being decentralized and permissionless, and then he goes into saying that business interactions require some sort of settlement mechanism. Not all business settlement mechanisms are equal. It's a continuum. Before the creation of a legal system with strong rule of law, business was entirely relationship-based. And then he starts to reference Dunbar numbers, which talks about our limitation as human beings and our trust within our circle of people that we know and how far that can go. But the problem is it caps out at 150 people under that theory. And so you can't do business worldwide using just a relationship-based system. Yeah. So he goes on to say that the reason that, where does he say it? This means that you must build some amount of trust or rely on reputation, a trust relationship. It's funny, you talk about a lot of this in your white paper, to conduct business in this system. Enter blockchain. Blockchain transactions are backstopped by math, cryptography, and they don't require relationship building. They just require that you live in a jurisdiction with a strong rule of law and a reliable legal system. That means no limitation on how many people you can do business with. The problem with that, and I saw this comment, and I didn't post it, but I saw this comment, and the comment was, what about dispute resolution? So you have all this nice theory about this peer-to-peer transaction that is really trustless, but what about disputes? And there was no one followed up on that comment. Yeah. And I was like, I was reaching through my computer. I'm like, this is what Wesley's writing about in his white paper. We need to have some sort of dispute resolution mechanism. And that dives right into decentralized arbitration. Yeah. Talk about this idea of decentralized arbitration and why this might be the solution to this problem.
Yeah, so what you're saying is exactly one of the questions I had when I started this research. So it is funny that even a lot of decentralized arbitration projects that I looked at, they simply just stopped at the cyber level. Let's say, okay, we have a court system that rules on a certain case, and then the question is, okay, but what if someone gets a ruling and they don't do what the ruling says? I mean, there's no real force within if you're just doing something on cyberspace. And that is sort of like the question that this guy is trying to solve, and a lot of I didn't see anyone who looked outside of cyberspace, and then they're going to look into reputation systems. So there's this one organization, it's called Pangea, and they came up with a reputation system. So everybody who is part of this DAO, let's say, they get a certain identity, and they are expected to sort of adhere to the standards because they are within that certain system. Now, obviously, you know the legal system. I mean, if the prices are high enough, people will probably not care about their reputation. So so there is a problem with enforceability for all these projects, and especially if a lot of money is involved, and especially if bigger companies are going to get involved in this space, they're not going to rely on these sort of like hypothetical and philosophies. I mean, that's not how the world works. So if we just look at that, I mean, they're coming back to the idea that these are all private contracts. There are actually a lot of legal frameworks existing that enforce private contracts. And obviously, you have it on the national level, but you also have it on the international level. And there's the New York Convention. I forgot the date. I think it's 1953 or something around that. And that is basically an agreement, again, international law. So it's between existing nations, where they agreed if an arbitration case has been settled in one of the jurisdictions, that it's going to be enforceable in the other jurisdictions. So what that means, if we sign an agreement under the New York Convention, then you and I, that we can decide where the arbitration court is. There's a lot of, most famous one, Hong Kong, Singapore, New York, London. And then when a ruling is issued in one of those places, this can then be enforced in wherever the participants are living. So if I would have a ruling against you in the US, I would just go with my Hong Kong ruling. I could go to the US court system and get it enforced, so that you could actually be forced to pay. Instead of just me publicly saying me on the internet or something.
Why do you like this idea of arbitration over a jury system? And I'm basing this off of the English model that is now been adopted in the US, and the idea of a trial by jury in a civil context. Why do you like the arbitration, which frankly I don't disagree with you on, but I just wonder why you thought that was the path to go down, as opposed to putting this in some sort of jury situation where we have like peers that are actually ruling on these things or making decisions.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of argument, especially because we are online. The main argument is obviously, a jurisdiction is always bound to one of the other countries, right? So, so then you would have to go to a court case. For one of them, the court case would be in a foreign court, which could be very problematic. I'll give you an example. I have a friend who is involved in a court case. He lives in Aruba, and the supplier is in Germany. And then, he has to, the contract is under the German law, and he has to go to the German court system. So he has to hire a foreign, it's very problematic. And even if he is right to get it enforced and to deal with it in a different language, that's another thing. And plus the court system, if you look at how it has been set up, there's usually a couple of stages, and it's quite a long process. And for example, you can appeal, and then it could go to the Supreme Court, just in theory, right? And so there's a very lengthy process, and that is also something that can be solved with arbitrage. Because if we sign a contract, we say, okay, arbitrage is going to ruin this contract. There's just going to be three people, the arbitrage court. They're going to have hearings, and then they decide, and that's it. There's no appeal. So it's for commercial contracts, which most of this blockchain technology as of now will probably be. That seems perfect, far better than. And that's another thing. If we want to really be serious about creating a legal system for blockchain technology, then you need people who rule on that with knowledge. And if you go to a random court system and start talking about a DAO or decentralized finance, these people, they don't know what you're talking about. There's a funny court case about, I think it was Ripple, and there was there was one of the predecessors of Ripple, and they tried to explain to the judge what a blockchain was. And it's very, very simple, because the guy was like 80, and he was like, blockchain what? And that whole, it just went on like that. Yeah, decentralized money. Oh, money, decentralized, It's so I mean, you will get ahead of that with having a certain court system, which is in a jurisdiction with it's friendly to international finance, and then that will make it much simpler, I think. Yeah.
So really, then it just comes down to there's the framework. The idea then is what laws govern this, right? And we talked about consensus jurisdiction, or even basing it on some sort of English law or whatever law that would be recognized by the parties. And then it comes down to enforcement, because you're right. At the end of the day, what I took away from your white paper was really trying to bridge the gap that exists between cyberspace and the real world.
Yeah.
Because if you said it earlier in this podcast, if you get a judgment or some sort of award in your favor, you're owed money by another party.
Yeah.
And this is what you said. I think you used the term it's a paper tiger if there's no enforceability. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't go anywhere. So this is bridging the gap. The idea of this legal framework, if I'm understanding it, is to bridge the gap between those two spaces, so that if you have a dispute that arises in cyberspace, there is an enforcement mechanism that can happen in the real world. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the beauty of the legal system is that it's pretty flexible. So whatever we agree in an agreement, we can have that govern the law. So we can choose our own governing laws. We can choose the court where it's ruled on. And so it's relatively, and it's also relatively easy if you compare to if you look at Bitcoin, how difficult it is to secure the network, and it's a very complex system. We have a lot of people involved, but in a contract you just add these laws and this legal system govern this contract, and that's it. Now, obviously, there's other questions to be had about enforcement, and then there's a lot more options you can do in the decentralized world. But if you want to have enforcement in the real world, that is relatively simple. And the frameworks already exist.
What if there's a disagreement on what laws should apply? So this is where you started talking about, I think at the end, you were talking about the idea of maybe using wikis to help create a platform so that there could be input from the masses as to how to set up the governing laws. And maybe I misunderstood that, but the thought would be, look, if we need to codify laws, if we need to create a governing law, and I'm talking about at the first level, right? The dispute level within the cyberspace. So not beyond that into, basing on English law or some other law that may exist internationally. I'm talking about just simply at that first level. How do you envision that happening? How do you envision a platform being created so people can give their input and help create this framework that could eventually be adopted and utilized in the blockchain technology going forward?
Yeah. So, what the real question is that if we create some sort of consensus jurisdiction, what does it really mean? What does it say? So, for example, let's say we are in the oil business or something, and we all want to create a decentralized jurisdiction and payments on the blockchain. Now, for example, what we could do, we could come up with a sort of like a general legal framework that covered all oil transactions, and everybody who's participating in that market has the same, follows the same regulations. So that makes the contracts much easier to do. So the contracts would just cover the details. And within that industry, we have this consensus jurisdiction. So, for example, if we take that option, the next question then was who determines what the rules are? And so there's different solutions. The first one would be obviously to just have one sort of like a party who's central to this industry, who comes up with a legal framework, probably based on something already existing, and they sort of like become like the author of this system. Alternatively, we could now look at, for example, a DAO, because that's another way in which people interact and come up with legal systems together. So, for example, I don't know if you have a lot of experience with DAOs, but what this means is there's a bunch of people coming together and they vote on certain kind of topics. So if we could, for example, say, oh, this kind of clause, this was, that didn't really sit well within the last court case, for example. So shall we change it to this? And then people can vote, whoever wants to participate. And so there's a lot of different ways that could work. Now, another thing that could be interesting is the blockchain. Blockchain is obviously a ledger of transactions, but it's more than that, because it can include code and It can also create links to, for example, text. What could happen is that we come up with a contract and we put it on a blockchain, and then it becomes secured. And then everybody can look at what the laws are that apply to interaction. It's all voluntary, so they can see, okay, this is something I want to work with, and then they connect their contracts to it. And so that would be a way for the blockchain to use. As you said, we can use Wikipedia, the same kind of software. We can store that on a decentralized platform, and then create clauses and legal systems based on that, and have the blockchain secure it.
I mean, you're essentially talking about creating a constitution or a Magna Carta or some sort of document that exists, that's transparent to all, that can have input and can be changed. I think that's important. You reference that in the white paper, that law is evolving. It doesn't remain static. And I think as long as there can be this agreement amongst a good group of people to put this together, then you just start attaching, like you said, you start attaching transactions and contractual relationships to it, and you have your framework. And there's going to be things that are going to come up that maybe weren't contemplated, and then there's solutions on how to solve those issues. But it creates some sort of mechanism that allows the overall blockchain to function in a way that has some legal framework around it.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And what has happened since I wrote that white paper, there have been a lot of developments, and one of them is I forgot the exact term, but there's a decentralized protocol for file storage. So now you have if you store something, it's on your own server, for example, on your own website, and then you can link to it. So it's no longer decentralized. But what you now have, decentralized servers. So you store something online, and it's stored just as blockchain transactions are stored. So that means you can have now a contract or whatever, a piece of legislation that is fixed, and that's the same for everybody around the world. So then, the next step comes. Then it's just a matter of recognition. And if we, as you said, you already mentioned Magna Carta, which was a quite fundamental document, right? Which limited the power of the kings, the king in England back in the 13th century. But there's absolutely no reason to come up with a new kind of document, which then, as long as people start recognizing it, that could then become a new kind of system. And I'm actually working on this idea right now to come up with a couple of these kind of documents that then become fundamental to, as long as people recognize it. That's the whole idea, right, of law, as long as it's recognized. I mean, the founding fathers, they just put some words on paper and then signed it. I mean, it was just a piece of paper, but then it changed, because people recognize it, and they, that's how all these legal systems came about.
This is, I meant what I said when I started this podcast. I think it is one of the most influential white papers that has come out in the blockchain technology in cyberspace. I really urge all of our listeners to go read it. It's a little thick, it's dense. You may have to stop and go have a cup of coffee and come back to it, but you don't need legal training. Wesley does an incredible job of talking about the history and explaining concepts in a very easy to understand way. You don't have to be a lawyer to read it or to understand it. You just have to be a human being trying to understand where we're headed in this space. I'm going to put the link up on our podcast so you can just click on it and it'll take you right to Wesley's site. Wesley, before I let you go, I do something to end every podcast. I call it Fast Five. It's 5 questions that don't necessarily have to do with anything we're talking about. Okay. Will you indulge me in this real quick?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, first question. How many languages do you speak?
3, understand 4.
Okay, what language? So obviously English.
English, Dutch, Spanish. In German, but not.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you have any, are you able to communicate living in Hong Kong is it Mandarin there? What is their language?
It's at Hong Kong time frame, but I'm currently in Bali.
Okay.
Indonesia, yeah.
Not a bad place to be.
Not a bad place. And the language here is very simple. I haven't come around to study it because, I don't know. I have so many things to study, but It might
You have
be,
enough on
it
your.
might be the next one.
You have enough on your plate. When did you first invest in cryptocurrency? What year?
2014.
Okay.
Dutch
Do you
coin.
own any? Dutch coin? Do you currently own any NFTs?
No, but I'm gonna make one.
Okay, keep me posted on that. I'm investing slowly and passively, but I'm very interested in what's happening with that technology and the idea of digital art. And now it's beyond that. It's becoming more of access and exclusivity. It's fascinating to follow. Okay, fourth question. Do you know? I actually looked this up. Do you know how many windmills there are in the Netherlands?
No.
Any guess?
But I can tell you that they're very well taken care of. They are, yeah, they're part of the heritage. A lot of them still work. At least, they're still turning. Some people living there. Yeah.
Give me a guess. Give me a guess of how many you think there are in the country.
200.
There's over 1,100 windmills in the Netherlands.
You mean the old ones? the traditional ones.
Okay. Yeah, that's on Wikipedia. I used Wikipedia to find that. I don't even know if it's accurate.
Yeah, it would have taken me as well.
All right, final question. What is your favorite food in Bali, where you currently live? Favorite thing to eat?
Yeah, nasi goreng, I guess.
What is that?
Which is just fried rice with a bit of egg and chicken. Yeah, it's good.
Oh, yeah, it sounds great. Wesley Thysse, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you from me personally for writing this white paper. It changed the way that I am looking at this space and what we're doing even on our own at our own law firm here in the States. I really appreciate the work. I'm excited to see what you come up with next. Please stay in touch. And if anyone wants to reach Wesley, I'm going to put all his contact information up there. You can certainly reach him. There is quite the time difference if you're in the States, so just be patient. He will get back to you, but it may take him a little bit of time. Thank you for joining me, Wesley.
Yeah, welcome.